The winter crept down from the Bighorn Mountains like a gray wolf stalking its prey. Wind carried the scent of coming snow and dust across the silver-pale grasslands, where cottonwoods shook their leaves like skeletal hands against the darkening sky. Jonas McKenna stood against the fence rail, his work gloves hanging loose from his belt, breath turning to smoke in the cold air. 3 years had passed since Helen's death, and the house still echoed with silence where laughter should have been. The ranch waited for a cook and helping hand. Cattle huddled together in the pens. Hay troughs growing thin, and the blackened bean pot on the stove reminded him of too many meals eaten standing up, alone. He'd posted the notice in town 2 months ago, but Wyoming Territory in 1889 wasn't kind to those seeking honest work, especially with winter bearing down. The sound of iron wheels grinding against thin ice made him look up. The mail wagon pulled up before the porch, cold wind rushing into the kitchen with the scent of fresh snow. He hadn't expected anyone this late in the season. A woman stepped down from the wagon. Her name was Mara, though he didn't know it yet. Gray dress worn but clean, boots patched at the toes, eyes the blue of deep winter ice but steady as bedrock. She held a bundle wrapped in blankets close to her chest. "You McKenna," her voice was hoarse from the long road. I hired for a cook." His words came out careful, measured. She adjusted the blankets around her bundle. "Speaking plain, I come with a child." "What if I told you to turn back?" He asked it straight, the way men did out here where words were precious as water. "Then I'd go, but work means the boy won't starve." The kitchen warmed slowly, bitter coffee steaming in tin cups. She unwrapped the blankets enough to show the child's face, Asher. She called him revealing eyes the color of winter steel, quiet and watchful. Jonas felt his chest tighten. Those eyes were the same shade he saw in his shaving mirror each morning, the same his father had carried, and his father before him. The words rang in his mind like a church bell on Sunday morning, clear and unavoidable. A widowed cowboy hired a cook, but she came with a child, then he saw the child had his eyes. Memory pulled him back to a rainy night in Abilene 4 years past. Oil lamps swaying in the saloon, fiddle music off-key, his own laughter mixing with whiskey and loneliness. A woman with kind eyes and gentle hands, whose name he'd never asked, whose face had blurred with mourning and regret. She set down her cup, hands steady despite the cold. "I sent letters to the ranch. They came back unopened. Hotels and boarding houses don't take children." Every door shut in our faces. We walked west until the road ran out of mercy. "I'm not asking for charity," she added, chin lifting slightly. "You need a cook. I need work. The boy needs a roof." Jonas questioned her about cooking, keeping house, managing supplies through a Wyoming winter. Each answer came sure and practical. No flourishes or false promises. She knew the work and wasn't afraid of it. He made his decision the way he'd learned to make all decisions since Helen died, quick and final, before doubt could creep in. "You and the boy stay." The words settled between them like a contract signed in frost. That first night, the house changed its breathing. Not louder, just alive. The kettle sang on the stove like a small bird seeking spring. Footsteps crossed floors that had known only his boots for too long. In the corner of the kitchen, she'd made a makeshift crib from an old apple crate and folded blankets. The boy sleeping with one small fist open as if reaching for something safe. Jonas sat by the dying fire, listening to these new sounds. He thought about the letters she'd sent that never reached him, or maybe they had, and he'd been too drunk with grief to open them. He thought about a child walking roads that led nowhere kind, about doors closing in small faces, about eyes that matched his own. The wind howled outside, promising a hard season ahead, but inside, for the first time in 3 years, the house felt less like a tomb and more like what it used to be, a place where people lived instead of just survived. "Come morning," he'd start teaching the boy about horses. "Come morning," he'd fix that loose board in the kitchen floor. "Come morning." He'd figure out how to be whatever it was he needed to be for these two strangers, who weren't strangers at all. But tonight, he just sat and listened to the kettle sing, to the child's quiet breathing, to the sound of Mara moving softly in the kitchen, setting things to rights. The house wrapped around them all like a promise half-remembered, waiting to be kept. Outside, the first real snow of winter began to fall, covering the hard ground in white. It covered the wagon tracks leading to the ranch, covered the fence posts and the barn roof, covered everything that had been with something new. By dawn, the world would look different. Jonas thought maybe that was fitting. He rose, banked the fire careful for morning, and headed to his room. As he passed the kitchen, he saw Mara sitting by the boy's crate, one hand resting light on the blankets. She looked up, nodded once in acknowledgement of the unspoken things that would need speaking eventually. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Get some rest," he replied. "Morning comes early on a ranch." It wasn't much of a conversation, but it was a beginning. And beginnings, Jonas had learned, were precious things in a land that seemed to specialize in endings. Dawn came thin and sharp as a blade. The kitchen glowed with fire warmth, filled with the scent of baking biscuits and rendering bacon fat. The cast-iron skillet sang its morning song, crackling and popping like it hadn't done in years. Mara worked as if she'd always known every crack in the floorboards, every stubborn cupboard latch. "If breakfast ain't ready before the sun clears the barn roof, it'll taste of regret and burnt beans," she said, not looking up from the stove. Asher slept in his makeshift crib in the corner by the pantry. One small hand lay open against the blanket, fingers spread like he was reaching for something only dreams could show him. Jonas moved quiet in his boots. "I'll bring in more wood before the stove remembers it's winter. Bring enough for the whole day. Winter's got a long memory in these parts." He smiled, just a thin line barely holding. Her tartness didn't scratch at anyone. It just kept the kitchen fires burning proper. The ranch hands filed in for breakfast, Tom Miller first among them, followed by young Eddie Hoffman and the Basque shepherd they all called Piper. Their spoons stopped midway to their mouths at the first taste. Then came the short, grateful sounds of men who'd forgotten what real cooking tasted like. "Ma'am," Miller said after his third biscuit, "if you're planning on staying through spring, I might just live to see another year." "Whether you live or die depends more on whether you track mud through my clean kitchen," Mara replied, but her eyes held warmth. After breakfast, Jonas cleared out the small storage room off the kitchen. He dragged out old rope and dented lanterns, pulled back the wooden shutters to let a square of cold light fall across the floor. "I want a place for a boy to grow proper." "He's got his crib. He's got my whole house, and he ought to have a bed." She heard the word bed the way she might hear the word home, like a promise trying to take root. Her hesitation lasted only as long as a held breath, then released. Jonas sought out Anders, the Norwegian carpenter who worked winter months at the sawmill, promised him good hay and trade for a bed frame, said come summer he'd add a feather mattress when the trading post restocked. "What color for the blanket?" Jonas asked, trying to sound casual about it. Mara looked up from kneading bread dough. "If pressed, I'd say blue. He smiles at blue things." "Blue it is. Then—" At midday, Jonas carried Asher out to the barn. The boy touched the soft muzzle of Copper's colt, his laugh breaking free like a ripe apple falling from a tree, pure and sweet and unexpected. "You can visit every morning if you're up before the kettle starts singing." The child nodded solemn as a judge. "Deal," he said in his small voice. Mara stood in the barn doorway, shoulders loosening a notch when she saw Jonas ready to catch the boy if he slipped, the rigid line of her spine, held so long against the world's hardness, eased just a fraction. That evening at supper, Miller made the mistake of muttering something about what comes after the stew words with an edge that suggested more than food. Jonas set his chair back slow and deliberate. "She tends this kitchen. Any man with opinions can share them with me. outside. The challenge hung in the air like smoke. Miller looked down, picked up his spoon. "Stew's mighty fine. Ma'am, mighty fine." Mara didn't need defending, and her eyes said as much. She simply ladled out seconds to everyone, answering rudeness with the fullness of a meal. Some battles were won with fists, others with grace. As night pulled its blanket over the ranch, they found themselves in the kitchen's warmth. Jonas worked on mending a bridle while Mara darned socks. Asher played with 2 wooden spoons on the floor, making soft clicking sounds like a tiny drummer. They didn't speak much, but the silence was different now, comfortable, like worn leather. Each had learned the other's rhythms, how Jonas always hung his hat on the second peg, how Mara hummed low when content, how Asher's breathing changed just before he needed picking up. "Storm coming," Jonas said, reading the signs in the way the firelight flickered. "We're ready for it," Mara replied. And somehow he knew she meant more than just having enough wood and food. When she rose to put Asher to bed, Jonas watched her careful hands, the way she tucked the blanket just so. He thought about all the nights she must have done this alone, in places that weren't safe or warm or kind. "Thank you," he said suddenly. She paused, looked back. "For what?" "For saying yes, for staying." Her smile was small but real. "Thank you for asking us to." Later, Jonas stood on the porch, watching clouds pile up against the mountains like gray wool. The house behind him held warmth and the sound of breathing a woman and child who'd arrived as strangers but were becoming something else, something his heart wasn't quite ready to name yet. He thought about Helen, about the dreams they'd shared that died with her, but tonight, for the first time, those memories didn't cut quite so deep. They sat alongside new possibilities, like photographs in the same album. The wind picked up, rattling the barn door. Jonas secured it, checked the animals, made his rounds. A rancher's day never truly ended, just paused between darknesses. But now, when he finished his chores, he had somewhere to return to that felt like returning. Inside, Mara had left a cup of coffee on the table, still warm, fixed just how he liked it. Such a simple thing, but it spoke volumes. Someone had noticed. Someone had cared enough to remember. Jonas sat, wrapped his hands around the cup, and listened to the house settling into night. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, it always did out here. But tonight, his house held more than just him and his ghosts. It held the beginning of something that might, with time and tending, grow into a family. The ledger lay open beside a cooling apple pie, Mara's handwriting straight as fence wire across the page. Flour, salt, coffee, and socks. "Socks don't lie about keeping warm," she said, tallying the week's needs. Jonas studied the list, nodding. "I'll head to town come morning. Roads are still passable. Barely." In Garrison's general store, the smell of kerosene mixed with burlap and old wood. Jonas moved through the aisles, gathering supplies, when Garrison himself leaned across the counter, voice low with the kind of gossip that poisoned wells. "Heard you took in a woman. Brought a child that ain't yours." Jonas set down his purchases slow and deliberate. "The boy is mine." The words came out calm but final, like a judge's gavel. Garrison's prejudice fell onto the counter with a thud, heavy as the knife he'd been using to slice cheese. Jonas added peppermint sticks to his order, a bolt of brown wool cloth, and 2 red marbles that didn't match but caught the light like tiny coals, small treasures for a small boy who'd known too few. The ride home came through thickening snow. Flakes fell fat and lazy at first, then harder, angrier, until the yard disappeared under a shifting white blanket. Inside, gifts unwrapped with careful hands, new boots for Asher. The boy stamped his feet, grinning. "They make me fast." The bolt of brown wool landed gentle in Mara's lap. Her pulse fluttered once, then steadied. "Good wool," she said simply, but her fingers lingered on the fabric like it was silk. That night, the storm slammed into the ranch like a fist. Wind screamed through the rafters. Out in the barn, one of the cows struggled with a difficult birthing, half her body already rigid with cold and fear. Jonas and Mara fought through the wind together, hands numb as iron. Jonas breathed warmth into the calf's nostrils, coaxing it back from that quiet edge where life gives up. The first breath came like a tiny miracle, steaming in the cold air. Mother and calf stood on shaking legs. The warm smell of straw and animal breath surrounded them all like a promise of spring hidden in winter's heart. Come morning. Asher lay sleeping by the kitchen stove, one peppermint stick still clutched in his small fist. Jonas looked out at the white-berried hills and felt something crack inside his chest, not breaking, but opening, like river ice in March. Days took on new rhythms. Jonas taught Asher to thread the stirrup straps, to brush Copper's colt with strokes that went with the grain of the coat. The horses learned to lower their great heads for small hands. Miller watched from the barn door, suspicious at first, then grudging in his approval when he saw how the boy listened to the horses with his whole face, understanding their language of snorts and stamps. Prejudice retreated one small step at a time. Inside, Mara mended Jonas's old work shirt, her needle moving slow and sure through the fabric. He relearned the words, "Thank you," finding new ways to say them each day. "Mara," he said one evening as she worked, "that first night, when you came, I should have asked more, about before, about how you came to be on the road." She paused, needle suspended. "Would it have changed your answer?" "No, but you deserve to have your story heard." She set down the sewing, hands folding in her lap. "I worked in a boarding house in Abilene, served meals, kept rooms. When it became clear about Asher, they let me go, said it wasn't proper, having an unwed mother around. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. I remembered you," she continued. "That night, you were kind, even through the whiskey. You talked about your ranch, about the mountains. When everything else closed against us, I thought, maybe kindness might remember too." Jonas felt the weight of those months she'd carried the closed doors, the turned backs, the long road with a child who had his eyes but not his name. "I'm sorry," he said, "for not being there, for not knowing. You couldn't know what I didn't tell." Her voice held no blame, just fact. "We all do what we must to survive. Now we try to do better." March wind carried dust in long streams across the prairie. Snow thinned to patches, revealing brown grass cracked like old leather. Jonas asked the question he'd been holding back all winter. "What if you stayed past the thaw?" Mara looked at him steady. "Roots that aren't owned are easily pulled up. Things that belong to us, nobody can uproot." He said it plain, without fancy words or whiskey courage. "Don't just be my cook, be my wife." She studied the window frame, the black outline of cottonwoods beginning to bud, then met his eyes again. "I'll say yes, if you mean it true." Never meant anything truer. Their first kiss came quiet beside the stove, gentle and sure and warm. Not the desperate grab of youth, but the careful greeting of two people who'd weathered their own storms. They rode to town under a pale, cold sky. The minister's office sat above the dry goods store, wood stove cold, Bible worn soft at the spine. The vows were simple things to have, to hold, to help each other through whatever came. Asher clung to his mother's skirt. Jonas knelt down to meet his eyes. "We're family now, son, all of us together." A thin gold band, worth less than a healthy calf but shining brighter than midnight stars. The marriage certificate signed with careful hands, witnessed by Garrison himself, who kept his opinions behind his teeth this time. Town gossip followed them home like dust devils. A woman with a fatherless child, a widower too quick to forget. But Mara built her own invisible fence through steady work, good bread, clean kitchen, smiles rare but genuine. Prejudice found little purchase on competence. Jonas invited the suspicious neighbors for Sunday dinner, fed them roast and potatoes, fresh bread and preserves, showed them how a home could be warm without asking permission. Some hearts softened over apple pie. Others didn't, but learned to keep their sourness to themselves. On the hill above the ranch, Helen's grave rested peaceful under prairie grass. Jonas climbed the slope alone, stood quiet in the wind, whispered words of gratitude and release. His heart learned to hold two truths without missing what was lost, embracing what was found. "I think you'd understand," he told the stone marker, "about second chances, about boys who need fathers and women who need homes, about hearts big enough for more than one story." The wind answered with silence, which felt like blessing enough. That night, Mara planted onions and potatoes behind the smokehouse, working the soil with hands already calloused but careful. The earth was stingy, but possible roots could grow here if tended right. Jonas and Asher helped, the three of them working until darkness fell. A family not born but built. One shared meal, one shared chore, one shared sunrise at a time. Spring birthing season came with its endless rounds of checking the herd. Smoke from the branding irons drew brown threads against the dry air, mixing with dust and the sweet smell of new grass pushing through cracked earth. Asher had grown another hand's width, steady now on Copper's young horse, tying rope with fingers that seemed to remember skills from some previous life. He sat the saddle like he'd been born to it, this boy who'd started his days in boarding house kitchens. Mara worked the ground behind the smokehouse, planting onions and potatoes with hands that had grown tough but stayed gentle. Even in stingy soil, roots could catch and hold if tended proper. The comparison to their own lives went unspoken, but understood. Jonas taught his son to read the sky's moods. See them fish-scale clouds, wind from the west best secure the tie-downs before supper. The lesson came useful sooner than expected. Word spread through the valley like wildfire cattle thieves working the ranges. Remnants from the die-up of '87 when the worst winter in memory killed 90% of some herds, leaving desperate men with empty bellies and flexible morals. Sheriff Clayton in town had developed convenient blindness, especially where the interests of big landowners like Samuel Hale were concerned. Money changed hands easier than cattle changed brands, and justice wore whatever coat paid best. Night brought hoofbeats under a slice of moon, strange horses moving Jonas's herd toward the canyon passes. The thieves knew their business moved quiet as shadows, pushing the cattle at a pace that wouldn't wake the dead. Jonas woke Miller and Piper with hand signals. They saddled up fast and silent, rifles across their laps, but not eager to use them. Gunfire in the dark had a way of finding innocent flesh, and killing a man over cattle was a weight that stayed heavy. They caught up at Skeleton Ridge, blocking the narrow passage. Jonas fired once into the air, a warning and a declaration. The thieves scattered like quail, leaving half the herd milling confused in the moonlight. Come morning, Jonas found evidence aplenty. Fresh-cut fence wire, a running iron still warm, horses shed with distinctive marks that led straight toward Hale's spread. The big rancher had been expanding his holdings through mysterious means ever since the die-up left smaller outfits vulnerable. Jonas brought his evidence to Sheriff Clayton, hoofprints traced on paper. Cut wire, witness testimony from Miller and Piper. Clayton shrugged with practiced indifference. Cattle do tend to wander. Hard to say where they might end up. Jonas rode home, hands clenched on the reins. At the kitchen table, he sat heavy while Mara poured coffee that steamed like accusation. "The law won't help us," he said simply. "Then we'll need patience and evidence that can't be argued with." Her voice held that particular steel women found when protecting what was theirs. Jonas started keeping detailed records. Every brand, every ear notch, every calf born and cow sold, dates, times, witnesses, building a case the way Mara built bread, one careful layer at a time. The summer sun poured down like molten brass. Prairie grass went brittle as old bones. Wind carried red dust that found every crack, coating faces until everyone looked related by dirt. Miller took a bad fall when his horse spooked at a rattler. While he healed, Asher stepped up to help with the stock. The boy who'd once been small enough to carry had become someone who could carry his share. He cleaned wounds, changed bandages, showed the patience of someone who understood hurt. Town welcomed a railroad spur line, bringing money and whiskey in equal measure. Drunk talk in the saloons grew bold about Mara, about Asher, about eyes that matched like 2 drops of water. Old stories never died in small towns, they just waited for alcohol to resurrect them. A liquored-up drover named Hutchins made the mistake of running his mouth at the broken wheel. That boy's bait, and the woman's a trap. McKenna got himself caught proper. Jonas stood without reaching for his gun. Sometimes the most dangerous man in the room was the one who didn't need to prove it. "You're welcome to dinner at my place. See for yourself what kind of trap a good meal in a warm kitchen make." He said it calm as discussing weather. Hutchins found himself agreeing before he knew what happened. When a man saw a boy reading by lamplight and a woman sharing bread with strangers, sometimes shame did what fists couldn't. Then came the fire. Hale's men set it in the north pasture, knowing the wind patterns, knowing how flame would race through drought-dry grass. The smoke rose like a signal of war, black and choking against the pale sky. Every hand on the ranch grabbed shovels, wet blankets, green branches. They fought to cut a fire break, sweating through shirts, coughing in the smoke. Jonas, Mara, even young Asher with his child-sized shovel, all working desperate against the orange wall, advancing like judgment. Asher stumbled too close to the flame line. Jonas dropped everything, diving for his son, rolling them both through smoldering ash, hair singed, skin blistered thin, but alive. The fear that seized Jonas in that moment crystallized into something harder than iron, a father's promise that needed no words. They saved the ranch by margins thin as paper. The fire died under sweat and determination, leaving the air tasting of char and defeat. That night, late supper had the flavor of survival thin soup that tasted like victory simply because they were alive to eat it. In the darkness, Mara told Asher about his name, how it meant happiness in the old tongue, but also referenced the biblical meaning, blessed ashes, one who walks through fire and still knows how to smile. Jonas listened from his chair, understanding finally that home wasn't built from wood and stone. It was made of a mother's voice telling stories and a child leaning into the sound of belonging. He thought of all the ways he'd been prepared to fight with guns, with fists, with legal papers. But sitting here, hearing Mara explain to their son how joy could rise from ashes, he understood the fight was already won. They were together. They were alive. The rest was just details. Morning would bring new challenges. Hale wouldn't stop. The sheriff would stay bought, and justice would keep its own slow schedule. But tonight, his family was safe under his roof, and that was wealth enough for any man. Jonas rose, checked the doors and windows out of habit, then returned to find Mara teaching Asher to darn socks. Such a simple thing, a needle pulling thread through wool, but it was also everything the daily work of keeping a family whole, of mending what was torn, of making sure love had warm feet come winter. "Room for one more student?" he asked. Mara smiled, shifting to make space. "Thread your needle careful. The fabric's worn thin in places." He sat, taking up the work. Outside, coyotes called across the emptiness. Inside, 3 people bent over their small tasks, building something stronger than fire could burn or thieves could steal. Building tomorrow, one stitch at a time. Autumn arrived with its harsh benediction. Cold wind cut across the prairie like a scythe, turning grass to gold and breath to frost. The county courthouse opened for its quarterly session, and Jonas brought his ledger's pages of evidence written in his careful hand, brands and dates and witness marks. 4 neighboring ranchers came forward to testify. Men who'd kept quiet now found their voices when they saw Jonas standing firm. The die-up of '87 had taught them all about loss, but watching one man fight back taught them about courage. Hale sat in the front row, arms crossed, expensive suit pressed sharp as his lawyer's objections. Sheriff Clayton shuffled papers, avoiding everyone's eyes. The judge, brought in from Cheyenne, had no local debts to pay. Case will be held for full review. The judge announced, not victory, but not dismissal either. In the West, sometimes that was all the justice you could expect, a promise to look closer later. Outside the courthouse, Hale stopped beside Jonas's wagon. "You're stirring mud that'll splash on everyone. McKenna." "Then folks better stand clear of mud puddles," Jonas replied, helping Mara up to the wagon seat. Mara went to market, head high despite the whispers that followed like tumbleweed. The banker's wife made a comment about women who knew their place. Mara looked her straight in the eye. "My place is beside my husband and son. Where's yours?" She paid for supplies with saved coins, each one earned honest. Pride was the warmest coat a person could wear, and Mara wore hers like armor. Jonas sought allies where power couldn't reach. Reverend Walsh agreed to witness any documents his collar might be frayed, but his word was good as gold. Mr. Chen, who ran the dry goods store, had no love for Hale after the man tried to force him out. Two voices that wouldn't bend for money. That night, Jonas and Miller sat watching the canyon mouth. The thieves came like clockwork, moving cattle through the wash where water would erase tracks by morning. They marked rocks with charcoal, left a rope with Jonas's distinctive knot pattern wedged between stones, small evidence, but sharp as cactus spines. A Hale rider named Garrett made threats at the Saturday market. Some folks don't know when to quit poking bears. Mara set down her basket, calm as prayer. "My kitchen's open to anyone hungry. That includes bears, if they remember their manners." Asher stood witness, learning another lesson: courage could speak soft and still be heard across the whole valley. Jonas auctioned 50 head at the fall sale, converting cattle to paper trail, every receipt filed, every brand recorded at the courthouse. Hale couldn't steal what was already sold and documented. Then came the ambush. Freezing rain turned the world to glass. Jonas and Miller rode back from checking the winter pasture when shots cracked through the darkness. Miller took lead in his shoulder, horse screaming as it went down. Jonas dragged his friend behind a boulder, returning fire just enough to keep heads down. They waited through the longest night, Miller bleeding slow but steady. Jonas pressing torn shirt to wound while rain turned to sleet. He got Miller home near dawn, more dead than alive. Mara worked by lamplight, knife sterilized in flame, hands steady as she dug out the bullet. Only after the bandaging. After Miller's breathing steady did her hands shake, but her voice stayed firm, giving instructions for care. Another line crossed, another proof that the game would end only when someone stopped playing. Jonas wrote everything down: the ambush site, the bullet saved in a kerchief, the tracks leading toward Hale's range. He posted letters to the territorial governor, the federal marshal, anyone who might listen. Water on stone it would wear through eventually. Winter closed in like a trap. Roads blocked, town cut off for weeks at a time. In the white silence, they learned each other deeper. How Mara hummed when worried. How Jonas traced wood grain when thinking. How Asher built snow forts with the same careful planning he used for everything. Christmas came sparse but warm. Mara made candy from hoarded sugar. Jonas carved a wooden horse that almost looked like Copper's colt. Asher gave them each a drawing stick figures, but clearly a family, holding hands under a crooked but determined sun. Miller healed slow, arm weak but working. "Could have been worse," he said, testing his grip on a coffee cup. "Will be worse if we don't finish this," Jonas replied. They made their plan careful as winter wolves. Document everything. Build alliances. Wait for Hale to make the mistake prideful men always made, believing themselves untouchable. February brought the territorial inspector, investigating reports of land fraud. Jonas presented his evidence neat as Mara's stitching. Other ranchers, emboldened, added their own testimonies. The inspector took notes, asked questions, promised nothing but thorough review. Hale's empire showed its first cracks. 2 of his riders quit, heading for Montana. The banker grew nervous about extended credit. Even Sheriff Clayton started hedging his bets, suddenly interested in proper procedure. At home, life continued its quiet revolution. Asher read aloud by the fire, sounding out words with determination. Mara's garden plans spread across the table like maps to a better future. Jonas found himself laughing at small things, the cat stalking a shadow, Asher's attempt at whistling, Mara's mock outrage when he tracked mud inside. They were building something hail couldn't steal or burn. A family is a fortress that walls can't contain, strengthened by every shared meal, every crisis weathered, every ordinary evening spent in extraordinary peace. One night, Jonas said what needed saying. "I'm sorry for the years missed, for not being there when you needed me." Asher looked up from his book. "You're here now." Simple words from a child who'd learned forgiveness before he learned to hate. Jonas felt his throat close up, nodded instead of speaking. Mara reached across the table, took his hand. "We all walked our own trails to get here. What matters is we arrived." Outside, winter howled its ancient threats. Inside, 3 people sat surrounded by lamplight and belonging, writing their own ending to a story that started with loneliness and loss. The fire burned low but steady, like hope itself, quiet, persistent, and warm enough to last until spring. Summer descended like a hammer on hot iron. The prairie cracked open like dried lips, and wind carried red dust that stung faces raw. Every waterhole shrank to mud, then to memory. Miller's horse threw him against a fence post when a rattler coiled in the shade, while he nursed cracked ribs and a wrenched knee. Asher stepped into the gap without being asked. The boy who'd once needed carrying now carried his share, learning to doctor wounds with hands steady as his mother's. "Hold still, Mr. Miller. This might sting some," Asher said, cleaning a cut with the same careful attention Mara used in her kitchen. "Boy's got healing hands," Miller admitted later, watching Asher rewrap bandages neat as any town doctor. The railroad spur brought changes thick as locusts. Fresh money flowed through town saloons, and with it came loose talk. Men with whiskey courage revived old stories about Mara, about Asher, about those matching steel-gray eyes that told their own truth. Saturday night at the Gilded Dollar, a drover named Hutchins held court at the bar. McKenna got himself roped proper. Woman shows up with a brat, claims it's his, and he swallows it whole like a greenhorn. Jonas entered quiet, hat low, shoulders relaxed. The room noticed without seeming to, the way folks notice a wolf among dogs. "Hutchins," Jonas said, voice carrying without rising. "You're welcome at my table tomorrow, Sunday dinner. See for yourself what kind of rope a good meal makes." The invitation hung in the air like a challenge wrapped in courtesy. Hutchins found himself nodding, trapped by his own bluster. When a man who'd called you fool invited you to eat at his table, refusing meant admitting cowardice. Sunday came hot and still. Hutchins arrived uncomfortable in his best shirt, expecting what instead he found Asher reading from McGuffey's Reader, Mara serving roast that melted on the tongue, Jonas discussing cattle prices like any neighbor might. "Your boy reads well," Hutchins said finally, watching Asher sound out a difficult passage. "He works at it." Jonas replied, "Man needs words as much as rope skills out here." By the time Mara served pie, Hutchins' shame sat heavier than the meal. He'd come to judge and found himself witnessing something he'd maybe never had: a family built on choice rather than chance, stronger for being tested. "I spoke out of turn," he said at the door. "Won't happen again." Jonas nodded. Some battles you won with fists, others with fresh bread and patient grace. The dry spell broke all records. Cattle stood hollow-flanked, ribs showing through dust-caked hides. Every rancher watched the sky like it might remember how to rain if stared at hard enough. Then Hale played his next card. The fire started in the north pasture where drought-killed grass stood like tinder. Wind patterns studied. Timing perfect, the blaze raced toward Jonas's ranch like orange death. Smoke rose in a black fist against the brass sky. Fire, Asher spotted it first, pointing from the barn roof where he'd been fixing shingles. Every hand grabbed tools, shovels, wet blankets, green branches cut hasty. They met the fire head-on, trying to cut a break before it reached the building, and smoke thick as wool, heat that blistered skin through shirts, the roar of flames eating the world. Jonas saw it happen like a nightmare slowed down. Asher, small shovel in hand, stumbled on loose ground. The wind shifted, pushing flames toward the boy faster than thought. Jonas dropped everything, diving through smoke and heat. He caught Asher, rolling them both away from the fire line, through smoldering ash that stung like hornets. His hair singed, skin blistered along his arms, but Asher was safe in his grip. "I've got you, son. I've got you." The fear that seized Jonas in that moment hardened into something beyond words, a father's promise written in flesh and flame. They fought the fire to a standstill, every person black with soot, coughing smoke. The ranch survived by margins thin as paper. That night, exhausted past speaking, they ate soup that tasted of char and victory. "My fault," Asher said quietly. "Should have watched my footing." "No fault but the man who said it," Jonas replied. "You fought like a grown man today. I'm proud." Mara treated their burns with cool cloths and salve, her hands gentle but her eyes hard as flint. "This ends," she said, "one way or another." In the dark kitchen, she told Asher about his name, how in the old tongue it meant blessed, but also connected to ash trees that grew strong after fire. "You're named for surviving, for growing back stronger. Today you proved your name true." Jonas listened. Understanding bloom in his chest. All his life he'd built walls against loss, against feeling too much, against hoping for what might disappear. But walls couldn't protect what mattered. Only love could do that, and love required standing in the open, willing to burn for what you'd chosen to defend. Word spread about the fire, about Jonas diving through flames for his boy. Even hard men who'd seen the worst the frontier offered found themselves moved by a father's devotion proved in scorched skin and singed hair. At the general store, Mrs. Patterson, who'd led the gossip about Mara, watched Jonas help Asher pick out new work gloves. Saw how the boy looked at his father like he hung the moon. "That's a fine boy you're raising," she said, surprising herself. "His mother deserves the credit," Jonas replied. "I'm just trying to catch up." Small surrenders, hearts changing one at a time, like dry ground accepting rain after drought. Jonas filed charges about the arson, though Sheriff Clayton made excuses about no proof and accidents happen. But other ranchers started speaking up. Hale's empire of fear showed cracks where courage seeped in. One evening, Jonas taught Asher to braid leather while Mara worked on a new shirt, Jonas's old one being past mending after the fire. Strong hands, but gentle. Jonas instructed, like holding reins. Too tight and it fights you. Too loose and you lose control. Asher concentrated, tongue poking out slightly. The braid came together slowly, but true. Like this. "Perfect. You'll make a fine horseman." "Already am," Asher said with 8-year-old certainty. "You taught me." Such simple words, but they lodged in Jonas's throat like tears. He'd spent 3 years learning to live with grief, only to discover joy could ambush a man just as thorough. Mara looked up from her sewing, caught his eye, smiled. In that moment, the kitchen held everything worth protecting: a woman's knowing smile, a boy's concentration, the small sounds of family going about the business of being together. Outside, summer thunder rumbled promises it might not keep. Inside, 3 people worked at their separate tasks that were really one task: building tomorrow from whatever today provided, strong enough to weather whatever storms came calling. Fall arrived with its sharp teeth. Wind cut thin across the prairie, and the county courthouse opened for the quarterly session following a murder at the stage depot. Jonas brought his ledger's months of careful documentation, brands traced on paper, sworn statements from 4 neighboring ranchers. The courtroom smelled of tobacco and boot leather. Judge Morrison from Cheyenne presided, a man whose reputation traveled cleaner than most. Hale sat with his lawyer, confidence wrapped around him like an expensive coat. Jonas presented his evidence methodically: the cut fence wire, the rope with his distinctive knot, the testimony of men who'd finally found their backbone, each piece small as a pebble, but together they made a wall. Sheriff Clayton shifted papers, avoiding eyes like a man counting sins. When called to testify, he mumbled about insufficient evidence and cattle naturally wandering. Cattle don't naturally wander through cut fences, Jonas stated flat, and they don't rebrand themselves. Hale's lawyer objected to everything, but Judge Morrison overruled most of it. The judge had seen too many big men thinking law was just another thing to buy. Case will be held for full investigation, Morrison announced. Not victory, but not dismissal. The door to justice cracked open just wide enough to let hope squeeze through. Outside, Hale stopped Jonas on the courthouse steps. "You're making enemies you can't afford. McKenna." "Already got those. Might as well make them honest ones." Mara handled her own battles at the market. The banker's wife made cutting remarks about certain women knowing their place. Mara set down her basket of eggs with deliberate care. "My place is wherever I choose to stand. Today that's here, selling eggs from my own chickens to buy flour for my family's bread." The words rang across the market square. Some women nodded approval behind their hands. Others turned away. But the tide was shifting, slow as seasons but sure. Jonas sought allies beyond Hale's reach. Reverend Walsh agreed to notarize documents his collar might be threadbare, but his word was sterling. Chen Lu, who ran the dry goods, remembered when Hale tried to force him out through fees and licenses that existed only in greed's imagination. Night reconnaissance became routine. Jonas and Miller watched the canyon passages, documenting the steady stream of cattle moving under darkness toward Hale's spread. They left markers, distinctive knots, carved stones, anything that would stand as witness when the time came. One night they got close enough to hear voices. Garrett, Hale's foreman, giving orders. "Take the young stock. Leave the old bulls too easy to identify." Miller wanted to confront them right there, but Jonas held him back. "Not yet. We need enough rope to hang them legal." A threat came to their door, delivered by one of Hale's men at the Saturday market. "Some folks don't know when to stop poking rattlers." Mara received it calm as accepting mail. "My kitchen feeds anyone hungry, including rattlers, long as they mind their manners at my table." Asher stood witness, absorbing another lesson courage didn't always roar. Sometimes it spoke quiet as bread rising, and was stronger for the silence. The ambush came during freezing rain that turned the world to glass. Jonas and Miller rode back from checking the winter pasture when rifle fire cracked through the darkness. Miller's horse screamed, going down hard, Miller's shoulder blooming red. Jonas dragged his friend behind rocks, returning enough fire to keep attackers honest. They waited through the longest night, rain turning to sleet, Miller bleeding slow but steady. Jonas pressed torn cloth to the wound, talking steady to keep Miller conscious. "Hell of a way to spend an evening," Miller gasped. "Beats playing cards with you. Least this way I know I'm getting cheated." Dawn came pale and reluctant. Jonas got Miller across his saddle, leading both horses through ice and mud. By the time they reached the ranch, Miller was more ghost than man. Mara worked by lamplight, steady as she'd been since that first day. Knife cleaned in flame. Bullet dug out with hands that knew their business. Only after the bandaging, after Miller's breathing steady to sleep, did she let her hands shake. "They mean to kill you," she said quiet. "I know." "Then we end this before they succeed." Jonas documented everything. The ambush site, the bullet wrapped careful in cloth, the tracks leading toward Hale's territory. He wrote letters to the territorial governor, the federal marshal's office, anyone whose authority reached beyond local purchase. Winter closed around them like a fist. Roads blocked, town unreachable for weeks. In the white silence, They grew into each other's spaces. Jonas learned Mara hummed Amazing Grace when worried. She learned he traced wood grain when planning. Asher built elaborate snow fortresses, each one designed like he was defending something precious. Christmas came lean but warm. Sugar hoarded for months became candy. Jonas carved a horse that looked almost like Copper's colt if you squinted. Asher gave them drawings, his family standing together under a sun that smiled despite being lopsided. "Best gift I ever got," Jonas said, and meant it. Miller healed slowly, favoring his shoulder but determined. "Could have been worse," he said, testing his draw. "Still got my gun hand." "Won't need it if we do this right," Jonas replied, but he spent time at target practice anyway. Asher watching from safe distance, learning that sometimes peace required being prepared for war. February brought unexpected ally, a territorial inspector investigating land fraud allegations. Jonas presented his evidence neat as Mara's stitching. Other ranchers, emboldened by one man's stand, added their own testimonies. The inspector, a thin man named Cartwright with eyes sharp as winter, took careful notes. "You understand accusations against prominent citizens require substantial proof." "Got nothing but proof," Jonas replied. "Written, witnessed, and some of it bled for." Cartwright promised only thorough investigation, but his presence sent ripples through town. Suddenly, Sheriff Clayton discovered interest in proper procedure. 2 of Hale's riders quit, heading for California. The banker grew nervous about extended credit. At home, life continued its quiet revolution. Asher read stories aloud, voice growing confident. Mara planned next year's garden, sketching plots ambitious as dreams. Jonas found himself laughing easier at Asher's jokes. At the barn cat's prideful hunting, at Mara's mock outrage when he tracked snow inside. "You're smiling more," Mara observed one evening, darning socks by the fire. "Got more to smile about," he replied, watching Asher practice writing, tongue poking out in concentration. They were building something beyond Hale's reach, a family tempered by trials, strengthened by choosing each other daily. Love was its own fortress, defended not by walls, but by the simple act of continuing. One night Jonas voiced the guilt he'd carried. "I'm sorry for not being there, for the years you faced alone." Asher looked up from his slate. "You're here now. That's what counts." Forgiveness from a child who'd learned love before bitterness. Jonas felt his throat close, nodded rather than trust his voice. Mara reached across the table, covered his hand with hers. "We all traveled our own trails to reach this table. What matters is we arrived." Outside, winter threw its worst at the walls. Inside, 3 people circled in lamplight, writing new endings for a story that began in loneliness. The fire burned steady as hope itself, quiet, constant, and enough to last until the world turned green again. Winter arrived like a fist through glass. Blizzards stacked against the mountains, and snow drove sideways hard enough to draw blood from exposed skin. The road to town vanished under drifts tall as a mounted man. Then fever took Asher. It started small, a cough at breakfast, tired eyes at noon. By nightfall, the boy burned like a stove, breath coming shallow and quick. His eyes, those steel-gray eyes that marked him as Jonas's own, went cloudy with the heat inside him. Jonas sat vigil. The chair pulled close to Asher's bed. The man who'd buried a wife knew the smell of serious sickness, felt old terror creeping back like smoke under a door. He whispered foolish stories, coaxed smiles, bargained with God for one more sunrise, one more breath, one more chance to be the father he'd almost been too late to become. "Remember when Copper's colt ate your hat?" Jonas kept his voice steady, though his hands shook. "You chased him clear around the corral, mad as a wet cat." Asher's lips moved, trying to smile. The effort cost him, sent him back into restless sleep where fever dreams chased him like wolves. Mara ground dried ginger, boiled willow bark, applied cool cloths with hands that never stopped moving. She was fortress strong through the days. But Jonas caught her on the porch at night, where wind could hide the sound of breaking. "He's fighting," she said when she saw him. "Gets that from both sides." "Gets it from you." Jonas replied, "I'm just learning to fight for what matters." 3 days, 3 nights. The fever peaked and held. Asher so still that Jonas found himself checking for breath every few minutes. The house grew quiet as a held breath, even the wind seeming to wait. Then, like ice breaking on a river, the fever cracked. Asher's eyes opened clear, focused on Jonas's face. "Did I miss chores?" Jonas laughed, or maybe cried hard to tell the difference. "You get a pass this week, son." In the white silence after the storm, Jonas spoke words too long held back. Not about the past that was written and couldn't be changed, but about the present. About choosing to be father not just by blood, but by deed, by presence, by the daily work of love. "I wasn't there when you needed me most," he said, Asher's small hand in his. "Can't change that, but I'm here now, and I'll be here tomorrow. And every day God grants me after." Asher squeezed back, weak but sure. "I know, Pa, I know." Recovery came slowly. The whole ranch seemed to breathe easier as color returned to Asher's cheeks. Even the animals sensed the lifting of shadow horses nickering softer, cattle settling calmer in their pens. They scraped through the lean weeks. Bones boiled for the 3rd time for soup. Cornbread broken carefully to make it last. Scarcity taught gratitude for the small graces, a spoonful of preserves, a cup of real coffee, a boy's laughter returning. One night, Hale's men tried the barn, but Asher, still weak but vigilant, spotted movement from his window. His whistle sharp and clear as Jonas had taught him cut through darkness. Jonas reached for the Winchester, but didn't shoot to kill. He fired at the lantern the intruder carried, letting darkness become his ally. The would-be thief fled, leaving boot prints and fear behind. Come morning, they found the man's horse, still saddled, tied with rope bearing the distinctive knot everyone recognized. The thief had been caught by his own tools, marked by his own methods. Jonas hauled the evidence to town once roads cleared. The whole town saw the horse, the rope, the brands that didn't match the rider's employer. Questions arose like spring flowers, pushing through the frozen ground of fear. More ranchers found courage. Pete Holbrook reported missing cattle. James Chen documented cut fences. Sarah Morrison, who ran the boarding house, testified about Hale's men bragging in their cups about easy pickings and teaching lessons. The tide turned slow but certain. Sheriff Clayton, reading the wind, discovered sudden interest in law enforcement. 2 more of Hale's riders departed for friendlier territories. The empire of intimidation showed cracks where justice seeped through. Through it all, Jonas kept building his case. Every incident documented, every witness named, every piece of evidence cataloged neat as Mara's pantry shelves. Water wearing down stone, drop by patient drop. Mara baked bread when they had flour, made miracles when they didn't. Her hands stayed busy, but her mind worked the problem too. "Law's one thing," she said one evening. "Public opinion's another. Hale needs both to keep his throne." She was right. At church, at market, at every gathering, the story spread. Not gossip, but truth, a family fighting fair against a man who fought foul. David and Goliath, played out in Wyoming snow. Even Mrs. Patterson, queen of proper society, found herself moved when she saw Jonas teaching Asher to read from the Bible, patient with each stumbled word. Hard to call a man improper when he was raising his son to know Scripture. Spring began its slow arrival. Ice cracked on streams, revealing water still running beneath. Patches of brown showed through white, promising grass would return, the earth itself demonstrating that what seems dead might only be waiting. One evening, Jonas watched Asher practice roping in the yard. The boy's movements showed growing confidence, the rope flying true more often than not. "He's getting good," Mara said, joining him on the porch. "He's getting strong," Jonas replied, inside and out. She slipped her hand into his. We all are. They stood together, watching their son practice the skills that would make him a man in this hard country. Behind them, the house that had once echoed with emptiness now hummed with purpose. Before them, spring prepared its resurrection. Whatever comes next, Jonas said, we'll face it together. Together, Mara agreed. That's the only way that counts. The sun dropped behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Hale wouldn't quit easy, and justice moved slower than seasons. But tonight, they had a boy laughing in the yard, a woman's hand in his, a home worth every fight it took to defend it. Jonas had spent years learning to live with loss. Now he was learning something harder and better: how to live with love, how to trust in tomorrow, how to build a future from the ashes of the past. It was terrifying. It was wonderful. It was worth every risk. As darkness settled over the ranch, he drew his family inside. Whatever storms came next, they'd weather them the way they'd weathered all the rest together. Stubborn as the grass that grew back every spring, no matter how hard the winter tried to kill it. The hearing convened on a Tuesday that couldn't decide between winter and spring. In the courthouse, tobacco smoke mixed with the smell of wet wool and nervous sweat. Judge Morrison presided again, his presence lending weight to what might have been dismissed as another range dispute. Jonas sat with his evidence arranged precise as Mara's garden rose. Reverend Walsh beside him, Chen Lu behind, Miller to his right despite the arm still weak from his wound. 4 ranchers who'd found their voices filled the next row. Even Mrs. Patterson sat in the gallery, her presence speaking louder than words about shifting allegiances. Hale entered like he owned the air itself, but something had changed. His lawyer looked less confident, shuffling papers like a man holding losing cards. Sheriff Clayton sat apart, badge polished but authority tarnished. Present your evidence, Mr. McKenna. Judge Morrison directed. Jonas stood, steady as fence posts, the cut wire, the rope with distinctive knots, the ledgers showing brands and dates. One by one, witnesses testified. Miller about the ambush, Chen Lu about threats and extortion, ranchers about missing cattle and cut fences. Then came the surprise. Garrett, Hale's own foreman, took the stand. Fear of the hangman's rope proved stronger than loyalty bought with wages. Mister, Hale directed us to move cattle from the smaller ranches, Garrett said, voice barely above whisper. Said the die-up of 87 left too many weak operations. Said it was natural selection, making the range stronger. The courtroom erupted. Judge Morrison's gavel cracked like gunshots until order returned. Hale's lawyer objected to everything, but the dam had broken. Truth poured through faster than legal procedures could stop it. Sheriff Clayton, reading the room like a man watching floodwaters rise, suddenly remembered several complaints he'd misfiled about Hale's operations. Sheriff Clayton, you're relieved of duty pending investigation, Judge Morrison announced. The badge came off Clayton's chest like a weightlifting. The judgment came down hard as Winter Hale fined for theft and fraud. His grazing rights on public land revoked. Restitution ordered to every rancher who'd suffered losses. Not prison money still talked loud enough to avoid that, but his empire crumbled like old adobe in rain. Hale left the courthouse smaller than he'd entered. As he passed Jonas, his eyes held the peculiar emptiness of a man who'd confused fear for respect, theft for strength. You've made an enemy for life, McKenna. Already had one, Jonas replied. At least now it's official. Outside, Jonas didn't celebrate. Victory in court was just paper until it proved itself on the range. He helped Miller to the wagon, poured coffee from Mara's thermos, watched the town digest what had just happened. It's done, Miller said. It started, Jonas corrected. Now we see if justice has teeth. They drove home through mud season, wheels catching and sliding, the world neither frozen nor thawed but caught between fitting weather for a day that changed the landscape of power in the valley. Mara met them at the gate, Asher beside her. She read the news in their faces before words were needed. "Hail?" she asked. "Defanged, if not destroyed, lost his grazing rights, owes restitution." She nodded once, sharp as an axe stroke. "Then we best get ready for whatever comes next. Wounded animals are the most dangerous." That night, Mara baked the first full loaves they'd had in weeks. The smell filled the house like celebration, though nobody called it that. They were too wise to count chickens still in shells, victories still fresh enough to reverse. Asher practiced reading from the newspaper account of the trial, sounding out the big words careful as walking ice. "Justice prevails in cattle dispute," he read, then looked up. "What's prevails mean? Pa. Means the right side won. Son, this time. Will it stick?" Jonas met Mara's eyes across the table. "We'll make it stick." The next weeks proved the prophecy. Hale's men, unpaid and abandoned, scattered like tumbleweeds. Some hired on with honest ranchers, glad for clean work. Others drifted toward territories where their skills still commanded premium prices. Jonas helped organize the Stockmen's Association ranchers banding together for mutual protection and fair practice. What started as survival became something larger: community, cooperation, the radical notion that neighbors could be allies instead of competitors. Sheriff position went to Ben Forsyth, a former marshal who'd lost his taste for bigger towns but kept his taste for honest law. First thing he did was audit the evidence lockup, finding all manner of lost complaints against Hale's operations. Seems Clayton was better at losing papers than keeping peace, Forsyth observed, dry as August grass. Spring unfolded like a promise kept. Grass pushed through snowmelt, calves dropped healthy, and the ranch that had scraped through winter began to breathe again. Jonas bought back some of his stolen cattle at fair price. No point punishing new owners for old crimes. One Sunday after church, Asher played marbles with the other boys while adults talked. No whispers about his parentage. Now courage had earned what gossip couldn't erase. He was Jonas McKenna's son. Full stop, period, end of story. Mrs. Patterson approached Mara at the church social. "I owe you an apology," she said, words stiff as her corset but sincere. "I judged without knowing. You've shown more grace than I deserved." "Grace is what we give when we remember we've needed it ourselves," Mara replied. "Would you like my receipt for those biscuits you admired?" Building bridges one recipe at a time. The kingdom of heaven might come through revelation, but the kingdom of earth grew from smaller miracles, shared food, forgiven slights, the decision to see neighbors instead of strangers. On a hill overlooking the valley, Jonas and Mara stood before Helen's grave. 3 years of weather had softened the carved letters, but the stone stood firm. Mara laid wildflowers she'd gathered, yellow and purple against gray granite. "I'd like to think she'd understand," Mara said quietly. "She would," Jonas replied. Helen believed in second chances, in life continuing even when it seemed impossible. They stood in companionable silence, past and present sharing space without competing. Below them, the ranch spread out like a map of hard-won peace cattle grazing, smoke rising from the chimney. Asher visible in the yard practicing his roping. "No jealousy between the living and the dead," Mara said. "Just gratitude for the love that was and the love that is." Jonas took her hand. Together they walked back down the hill toward their son, their home, their future written in ordinary days rather than grand gestures. Behind them, Helen's grave kept its quiet watch, blessed by spring flowers and the knowledge that love hadn't died with her. It had just changed shape, found new vessels, continued its patient work of healing what was broken. That evening, as they sat down to Sunday dinner, Jonas raised his coffee cup in a quiet toast. To justice served cold but sure, to neighbors who became friends, to family born of choice as much as chance. "To home," Mara added simply. "To home," Asher echoed, grinning. They drank to that, to home, to hope, to the hard-won knowledge that sometimes the best revenge against those who would destroy you is simply to survive, to thrive, to build something better from the ashes of their hatred. The fire burned warm in the hearth and outside. Spring continued its ancient work of turning endings into beginnings. Spring burst through winter's grip like a prisoner breaking chains. Ice cracked on the streams with sounds like rifle shots, and water ran free beneath, singing songs of liberation. The prairie grass pushed through snow patches, tender green against tired white. Nature's promise that nothing stays buried forever. Cottonwoods in the yard unfurled leaves like small banners of victory. Bees found Mara's onion flowers, working their ancient trade. Barn swallows stitched the sky with black thread, binding earth to heaven with their endless loops. Asher had grown past the marks on the kitchen doorframe. He sat Copper's colt now, a proper horse with the natural ease of someone born to the saddle. His hands on the reins showed Jonas's teaching, but his gentle way with the animals was all Mara's influence. "Easy does it," Asher murmured, guiding the horse through the gate. "We got all day and then some." Jonas watched from the porch, pride quiet as morning frost. This boy who'd arrived scared and small had become someone the ranch couldn't run without. Not just his son by blood, but by every shared sunrise, every lesson taught, every night spent talking through problems by the fire. Mara emerged from the garden, basket full of early greens. "Supper won't be fancy, but it'll be fresh," she said, dirt under her nails like jewelry earned through honest work. "Fresh beats fancy every time," Jonas replied, taking the basket, letting his hand linger on hers a moment longer than necessary. She smiled, that particular smile that had taken months to coax out but now came natural as breathing. They'd built something here, not just a working ranch, but a living home, each day adding another layer like paint on good wood. The ranch had stabilized. They'd bought 2 breeding cows with the restitution money, good stock that would strengthen the herd. Miller's arm had healed enough for full work, though he claimed it ached before storms. "Better than a barometer," he'd say, rubbing the shoulder. Town treated them fair now, not with enthusiasm. Maybe, but with the respect earned by standing firm when standing was dangerous. Garrison nodded when Jonas entered the store. "Mrs. Patterson asked after Asher's schooling. Small victories, but in small towns, those were the only kind that lasted. Sunday dinner had become tradition, the hands joining them. Sometimes Reverend Walsh, occasionally one of the neighboring families. The table that had once served silent meals now rang with conversation. Arguments about cattle prices, stories from the week, Asher's improving jokes. "Why did the chicken cross the road?" Asher asked, eyes bright with mischief. "To get to the other side," Miller answered, patient as always with the boy's humor. "No, to prove to the possums it could be done." Asher delivered the punchline with triumph, earning groans and laughter in equal measure. These were the moments Jonas treasured, not the dramatic victories, but the small domesticities. The way Mara hummed while cooking, how Asher still asked for one more story at bedtime, despite being old enough to read them himself. The sound of coffee perking at dawn, promising another day together. One evening, as purple twilight painted the hills, Jonas closed the barn and looked back at his land, the same view he'd stared at for years, but transformed. Where once he'd seen only loss and loneliness, now he saw possibility and purpose. Through the kitchen window, lamplight made a golden square against the darkening world. Inside that light, Mara helped Asher with his letters, patient with each crooked attempt. Home, Jonas thought. Such a simple word for something that had taken so much pain to build. He opened the door to warmth and the smell of rabbit stew. "Smells like heaven in here." "Tastes better than it smells," Mara promised. Asher caught the rabbit himself, set the snare just like you taught him. "Did it perfect," Asher confirmed, proud but trying not to show it too much. They sat to eat, Heads bowed while Reverend Walsh's training showed in Asher's simple grace. Thank you for this food, for this family, for this day. Amen. Amen, they echoed. And in that word lived all their gratitude for roads that had led here, through fire and fear to this quiet evening. After supper, Jonas brought out the ledger not for grim accounting, but to show Asher how the ranch worked. See here, this is what we spent on seed. And here's what we earned from the calf sales. A ranch is like a river, money flows in and out. But if you're careful, it keeps running. Asher studied the numbers with the same intensity he brought to everything. We're doing good. We're doing fine, Jonas confirmed. Better than fine? We're building something that'll last. Later, with Asher in bed and the house quiet, except for settling timber, Jonas and Mara sat by the dying fire. These had become his favorite moments, the day's work done, tomorrow's work waiting. But right now, just this, the woman he loved beside him, their son safe upstairs. Peace earned through trials that had tested but not broken them. I've been thinking, Mara said, hands busy with knitting what looked like small socks. Asher could use a brother or sister. Jonas felt his heart skip, then settle into a rhythm both new and familiar. You mean? Come autumn, she confirmed, smiling at his expression. This house has room for more laughter. He pulled her close, no words adequate for the fullness in his chest. They'd started with loneliness and loss, built through hardship and fear, and now this life insisting on continuing, on growing, on proving that love was stronger than anything the world could throw against it. Outside, coyotes called across the darkness, their wildness a reminder of the untamed world beyond the lamplight. But inside, 3 people, soon to be 4, had carved out a space where civilized things could grow trust, hope, family. Jonas thought of that day the mail wagon had brought them together, how he'd seen his own eyes in a stranger's child and recognized destiny wearing a dusty dress. A widowed cowboy hired a cook, but she came with a child, then he saw the child had his eyes. What had seemed like an ending had become a beginning. Loss transformed into unexpected grace. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, ranching always did. But tonight held perfect contentment, a good woman's hand in his, a brave boy dreaming upstairs, new life quickening, and the knowledge that some gambles paid off in ways money couldn't measure. Thank you, he whispered into Mara's hair. For what? For saying yes, for staying, for all of it. She squeezed his hand. Thank you for asking, for being the man we needed, for becoming the father he deserved. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the embers glow like tiny stars fallen to earth. Outside, spring continued its ancient work, seeds sprouting, animals pairing, the world renewing itself with stubborn hope. Inside, a family that had found each other against all odds settled into sleep, safe in the knowledge that tomorrow would find them together. The house on the hill stood solid against the night, windows dark but walls strong, holding within them all the things worth fighting for: love rescued from loneliness, trust built from betrayal, and the endless possibility of ordinary days made extraordinary by being shared. In the barn, horses dozed standing. In the pastures, cattle grazed under stars. And in the small bedroom off the kitchen, a boy who'd once had nowhere to belong slept deep and safe, dreaming perhaps of horses and horizons, of families that choose each other, of homes that welcome you no matter how long the road that brings you to their door. This was their happily ever after, not perfect, but real, not without scars, but healed, not the ending of their story, but the beginning of all the chapters yet to come. Thank you, dear listeners, for joining us on this journey through the Wyoming prairie, where love bloomed despite the harsh winters and justice prevailed against all odds. We'd love to hear where you're listening to this story, whether you're driving through the mountains, sitting by your own fireplace, or perhaps somewhere across the seas. Please subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Jonas, Mara, and young Asher's tale. Did their story touch your heart as it touched ours? Let us know in the comments below, and we'll see you in the next adventure from the American frontier.